Good evening. I'm Matt Jacobs, Director of the Bob Graham Center for Public Service. It's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event, whether you are here in the Okora at Pugh Hall or attending remotely. We're delighted to have you with us for this important conversation tonight. I want to begin by thanking the co-sponsors of tonight's event, the Dr. Patricia Hilliard-Nunn Sankofa Initiative, about which Dr. John Sensbach will say more in just a moment, the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, the History Department, African American Studies Program, the Rothman Endowment and the Center for the Humanities and the Public Sphere, the Political Science Department, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and if you couldn't already tell, the university as a whole, given that lengthy list. I also want to thank, as always, the team here at the Graham Center who does a fantastic job putting this kind of event on. It's absolutely outstanding, so thank you to Mary Ann and Dorothy and the student assistants who always pull this off so well for us. And given that it's Gator Giving Day, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank the supporters who make all the work that we do here at the center possible, and obviously for the broader college and all these other units who are partners on this. That support is vital to everything that we do. I need to also take care of some housekeeping. For those of you attending remotely, there will be a Q&A session at the end of the talk for everyone. Those here in the Okora will have a mic circulating so that you can ask your questions. Those of you who are remote, there is a little bubble down in the lower right corner of your screen, and so you can use that to submit your questions. We'll make sure that those are read and addressed here in the Okora. The title of tonight's talk is 20 Years of Studying Slavery in the University. What now? To be sure, it is vital that we understand that as a historical issue. But we must also understand it as an issue of the present. After all, in fall 2010, black students comprised nearly 10% of the undergraduate population here at UF. 10 years later, in the fall of 2020, there were less than 6% of the undergraduate population here. Those are UF's numbers, but it's a broader national trend of declining black student enrollment in higher education that was only exacerbated by the pandemic. Why is that the case? That question begs a second equally important one. What are we doing to be supportive and inclusive of the black students who are here on our campus or on other campuses already? Are we offering educational or other co-curricular opportunities that connect with their lived experiences? Are we helping them imagine a more inclusive future for themselves and their communities? The answers to those questions strike at the very heart of who or what the University of Florida is as an institution and the role that higher education, especially public higher education, plays in our society. To make sense of those very pressing issues of the present, we must be in conversation with our past. That is a goal of tonight's event, and it's one of the many reasons why I'm delighted that the Graham Center is one of the sponsors and hosts of this event. It's my pleasure now to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. John Sensbach, Professor of Colonial and Early American History and Chair of the Department of History here at UF. John will say a bit more about this particular initiative and then introduce our speaker. Please join me in welcoming John Sensbach.
Thank you very much, Matt, and thank you all for being here. In a moment, I'll introduce our speaker, Leslie Harris. The title of her talk is 20 Years of Slavery in the University's What Now? As her talk suggests, it's been about 20 years that institutions of higher learning have been studying seriously their involvement with the institution of slavery and asking hard questions about themselves and about their history. That study has begun here some years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. I was privileged to direct a group of honor students who initiated that study for the University of Florida, examining our institution's relationship to slavery before the Civil War. That inquiry took a radical turn, as I imagine it did on many college campuses, after the murder of George Floyd and other Breonna Taylor and many other people. In 2020, I guess it was, President Fox, president of our university, began a series of initiatives, racial equity and justice initiatives, to explore in more full detail the relationship of the University of Florida to people of African descent, Native American descent, and others. And various groups, task forces and other study groups have been diligently working in the couple years since that time. Many of these initiatives have come to be sort of classed under the umbrella of the Sankofa initiative in honor of the late Professor Patricia Hilliard-Nunn, who was actively involved in these efforts herself. So we are relatively new to the game, but we are joining many other institutions that are doing the same kind of thing and learning a great deal of information about our own history. And the question is, what do we do with that information now, as Professor Harris will try to explore with us. Professor Harris is one of the foremost scholars leading these kinds of investigations around the country. She's Professor of History and African American Studies at Northwestern University after having taught at Emory University for many years. She's the author of In the Shadow of Slavery, African Americans in New York City, 1626 to 1863, published by University of Chicago Press in 2004. And she's edited several other books, including Sexuality and Slavery, Reclaiming Intimate Histories in the Americas, co-edited with Dana Ramey Berry, and published by the University of Georgia Press in 2018. In 2011, while at Emory, Professor Harris organized a two-part conference, the Transforming Community Project, Lessons Learned, and Slavery in the University, Histories and Legacies. From that conference came another edited volume by the same title, Slavery in the University, Histories and Legacies, co-edited with James Campbell and Alfred Brophy, published by the University of Georgia Press in 2019. In the introduction to that volume, Harris, Campbell, and Brophy refer to what they call the cognitive dissonance, the difficulty many of us have in reconciling slavery, an institution now reviled as unnatural and abhorrent, with the ideals and values that we associate with universities, with progress, enlightenment, and the unfettered pursuit of knowledge. Yet, they point out, we shouldn't be surprised to find slavery's shadow on campus, given the long history and ubiquity of slavery in colonial and antebellum America. 20 years of study at universities such as Brown, Yale, Harvard, Georgetown, universities of Virginia, North Carolina, and many others provide overwhelming evidence of what Harris calls the routine reality of enslaved men, women, and children constructing the classrooms, cooking the food, tending the grounds, scouring the latrines, and even staffing the brothels of the nation's most venerable institutions. The research goes on, including here at UF, but it's also time to take stock of what we learned. What have recent revelations about universities and slavery taught us about our nation's history and about the history of American higher education in particular? Harris and her co-editors ask. What do they tell us about our own time? Why has the relationship between slavery and universities, a relationship hiding in plain sight for the better part of 2 centuries, become such a pressing concern today? What do these forays into difficult pasts actually accomplish? We're fortunate to have Professor Harris here this week to help us think through these questions. Please join me in welcoming Professor Harris.
Thank you for this wonderful introduction, this opportunity to speak with you. I want to just take a brief moment and add my thanks to everyone who helped to make my visit possible, the amazing staff here at the Bob Graham Center, various students who've walked me around campus. I got to teach a couple of slightly different things in a couple of classes. I'm just really enjoying my time here, and I'm going to see a few more things before I head back to Chicago tomorrow. So I'm just really grateful to be here, really grateful to not be in Chicago where it's snowing. So thank you for that as well. 20 years of slavery and universities. I want to start by saying that my decision as a scholar to focus on the history of slavery was one that surprised even me. And similarly, my decision to end up being someone investigating the history of slavery in higher education was also a surprise. My first book was one in which I began by studying free black people in antebellum New York City. But I learned and didn't realize how I learned that slavery had existed there and that gradual emancipation ended slavery in New York City in 1827, long before the Civil War and the 13th Amendment. When I would tell people that I was studying the end of slavery in New York, they would get a confused look. Slavery in New York? The end of slavery in New York? You mean during the Civil War? And I realized that I had to add 200 years of history onto the beginning of my book in order for it to make sense. The same thing happened in the years after my book was published. I was at Emory, and we had what maybe we still call in higher education a series of racial incidents. And it was a year-long series of racial incidents. It was a little bit more intense than the usual. It began with the use of the N-word, continued with a little blackface incident at a Halloween party, and ended at the end of the year with accusations of anti-Semitism for having invited the then president of Northern Ireland, to campus, who had supported Palestinian rights. We felt that we had really gone through the ringer. And some of us who had begun to gather at the beginning of the year to discuss what was Emory University, who were we as an institution of higher education, are we being who we think we are? People from all across campus, faculty, administrators, a few students, staff, of people who had been there a long time, people who were fairly new to the institution. We began to have deep and searching conversations about these very issues. By the end of that year, amid agreements, disagreements, requests for data from my more social scientific colleagues, we had forged bonds that meant that as events continued to happen, we trusted each other to talk about them and to think about how we could do things differently. And it was out of that experience that grew what we came to call the Transforming Community Project, where we wanted to share that experience of working through these issues around diversity, in that instance racial diversity, but we later expanded to talk about sexuality, gender, class issues, the Israel-Palestine conflict that was happening on our campus. We used a very simple framework to create a space, and I'm going to use the word safe space, by which I mean we were safe to disagree with each other even when we were uncomfortable. And I think we need to think about the difference between being unsafe and being uncomfortable. But people had difficult dialogues. We were aligned with the Ford Foundation, which had a difficult dialogue program that started soon after we did. And we, for 5 years, maybe a little longer than 5 years, we shared these, what I thought were very basic pedagogical techniques, but not simply with faculty and not simply with students, but with everyone who thought themselves a member of the Emory community. And the most people who turned out for that were staff, who were hungry for a way to contextualize their experiences on campus, to understand what their part was in this institution of higher education. Now, we had some material to work with because others had already been investigating histories of slavery and labor and race in higher education. The events I described that difficult year were 2003, but the year before that, a man named Mark Auslander at Emory University had created the Dream Deferred exhibition, which covered and investigated the history of slavery, Jim Crow, and the black communities that supported Emory from the time of its founding down to the present, including the descendants and people who still worked on campus. So that became our foundation. And we didn't know it at the time when we started, but Brown also began their university steering committee around the same time that we did. And I didn't learn until much later that Yale University graduate students had demanded that the university examine its history of slavery. They did not get off the ground with that demand, but that was an important precursor as well. Our year of strife, 2003 to 2004, also coincided with a faculty apology at the University of Alabama, where a group of faculty there, including my colleague and friend Al Brophy, who was in the law school then, said, there is a history of slavery here that we have not discussed. The faculty were involved in punishing enslaved people. we think that we need to acknowledge that history, and you got the faculty to sign on. So in addition to Brown's announcement of its investigation of slavery and universities, the faculty apology at University of Alabama was also one of the first moments in this, what would become the Slavery in University, as some call it, a movement. We launched the Emory Transforming Community Project in 2005. Our most successful part of that was the Community Dialogue Project, where faculty, staff, students, and alums, we created groups who met over a meal with peer facilitators who explored the history of race and racism at Emory, starting with slavery, moving through into the Jim Crow era, not forgetting Jewish exclusion, which is also an important part of our higher education history, and coming down to the present with the very events that had happened in that year of 2003-2004. So starting in the past, which at that time at least, we felt people could sort of be a little bit removed from it, but it's still important to study. And then by the time you get to the things that happened yesterday, this is sometimes, not always, but sometimes the historian's gift, you've worked on some of these issues, and you can then begin to talk about the things that really affect your day-to-day. And those groups did that work. They also did the work of not just reading the book and then putting it back on the shelf, watching the film, and then moving on. We encouraged them to think about, now that you know, what will you do differently? How will you transform this community? In addition, in this first generation of slavery and university projects, UNC Chapel Hill unveiled one of the first monuments to the unsung laborers, as it was called, still on that campus. It was put right beneath the Silent Sam Confederate monument as a rebuke to that segregation era monument. And then in 2006, Brown University's report on slavery and justice was released. We were all making it up as we went along. Many of these initiatives, with the exception really of the Brown initiative, but that also grew out of fervor on the ground, where we said, what if we did something different? What if we began understanding not just research out there, people out there, but what happened here? And how can we bring that together? In 2011, as was already mentioned, I had the great good fortune of working with some of these people to launch the first international conference on slavery in universities. We knew of the groups that I had on the screen before. When we announced this conference, we had enough other institutions for 2 to 3 days of panels. People we did not even know were working on this. We were all in our universities doing the work, but we had not gathered together yet. And so that was an amazing 3 days to realize the different ways that people were understanding this basic charge of being self-critical about the history of race on your own campus and, I'll say, in your community. The second generation of slavery and university projects then began to emerge after that conference. And I'm not making a link between the conference and that emergence, but I do want to say that some of these institutions were initially very resistant to this history, but are now doing things a little differently. The University of Virginia, probably the most ambitious, one of the most ambitious of this group, inaugurated a 5-year project on the study of slavery at that institution. And they have done amazing things there. They're now working on 5 years on the history of Jim Crow segregation, and I am eagerly awaiting the results of that. Their launch event, their school president was there. It was an incredible event that launched this 5-year initiative. And they concluded their 5 years with a really astounding memorial to enslaved labor on that campus. Drew Gilpin Faust finally in 2016 acknowledged that Harvard did have a history of slavery after resisting that for 10 years. And I'll remind you that Brown University among the Ivies stood alone for a good decade. Other institutions did not pick up the call to investigate that history. At Princeton, a faculty member launched a study of slavery at Princeton and had an amazing conference there, and her faculty colleagues contributed as well. And the University of Pennsylvania is another institution that resisted the belief that the Penn Medical School had been involved with the use of slave cadavers in the 19th century. And so undergraduate students, after a decade of denial, undergraduate students spent a year or two in the archives, and then they put on a conference with a faculty mentor demonstrating that, in fact, UPenn had been involved in slavery. Quakers, too, are involved in slavery. And as you may know, the UVA has inaugurated the University Studying Slavery organization to try to keep these connections among these different institutions together. We are also at a moment where we have moved beyond slavery in some places. Northwestern University, my new institution, it still feels new, and the University of Denver are investigating their connections to the Native American atrocity, the Sand Creek Massacre. Catholic universities are also looking at Native American histories as well as histories of African American enslavement. And I think that the inequalities ongoing between historically black colleges and universities and historically white institutions, I have a feeling those are going to be a burgeoning area of investigation and cooperation. I certainly hope so in the future. When we think about what all of this research, all of these collaborations, all of these moments, what has been the result? There have been some very important moments and results. Renaming is one. So Yale's Calhoun College, named for John C. Calhoun, states' rights and supporter of slavery. Calhoun College was named in the 1920s or 1930s. There's no commentary really in the minutes on why, but there it is. That college was renamed for Grace Murray Hopper, a woman, one of the first women computer scientists and a graduate of Yale. Princeton removed the Woodrow Wilson name from its School of International Affairs. Less than a year after it put up, you can see that monument, which was supposed to complicate the meaning of that name on the building to indicate that Woodrow Wilson stood for some progressive things in terms of international affairs and then some very retrograde, literally retrograde things in terms of race and racism. Many people at the school thought that that was not enough. And in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder, the president went back and said, no, we're going to take the name off after all. I mentioned memorialization. These two memorials are very important, the UNC Chapel Hill and then the University of Virginia memorial, commemorating and posing a counterpoint to, often on campuses, numerous monuments to enslavers, to Jim Crow, segregationists, etc. And of course, many websites and books. Probably, I know many more than the ones I've listed here, and eventually there will be too many to name. But is this enough? Is this all that universities can do? Symbolic change? The things that we've always done? Books, websites, archival work? Important, but is that enough? Is that where we stop? I want to go back to why we founded the Transforming Community Project very briefly and then expand from there. When we founded the Transforming Community Project, we knew some of this history already. We were trying to change the way race and racism had shaped the university. We were trying to move the university to a new place. Our key principle, one of my key principles, higher education communities are constantly changing. So how are the challenges we experience within our institutions reflective of changes in the broader society? Moving beyond the ivory tower that's somehow special and different from everywhere else. There's no ivory tower. We're all reflecting the same thing that's out there. It's in here. We're out there is in here. How do we, within our institutions, move in different ways? Because we do have more knowledge. That's our job, is to have more knowledge in here. What is our ethical commitment as an institution that is an integral part of the broader society? What is our ethical commitment to understand, adapt to, and model adaptation to change? What is our unique opportunity as higher education institutions to address the inevitable changes we see around us? We have a unique mission, unique histories, and resources. How do we leverage those resources for the greater good? Now, when we say higher education communities are constantly changing, if you think about it for just a minute, you know that. There are regular changes built into the system. Students arrive and leave, and here's the optimism. Hopefully they finish their degrees in 4 years, but as you know, many take far longer for the reasons we know well, financial. 2-year MAs, 5 to 7 year or more PhDs, other students. So the flow of students in and out can also transform our institutions. Faculty arrive, they move up the ranks, they leave the institution or they retire, they leave their mark. Staff come through and leave, and staff are often the largest group of people, and yet we often talk about them the least. And then, of course, the administrator life cycles. Presidents 10 to 12 to 15 years, provosts 5 years, more or less, deans 5 more or less. But the other set of changes that we don't talk about enough in higher education are the longer-term historical changes. And what we're living amid now is a distinct historical moment in terms of access to higher education. And frankly, we still haven't figured it all out because it's fairly recent. We are in a post-World War II moment still in terms of the ways that higher education has changed. We have changed from schools for the elite and the middle class to schools that promise to give a step up to all into the elite and middle class. Now, we can challenge that idea, but that's the idea we're selling. And I'll give you some figures about what the truth of that. But for many, if not most schools, and certainly for many students, that is the goal, to better our lives, if we believe that bettering our lives is becoming middle class or elite. We have also moved from racial and gender homogeneity in these schools to diverse populations. When we look at how schools used to admit students, we have moved from schools based heavily on open admissions, except of course for the racial or the religious or the gender exclusions, and heavily on legacy admissions. The idea that if your parents went to that school, you have a special entree into that school. And I should add here also geography. People didn't travel to most colleges in the past as well. So we've moved from there to schools that admit students based on competition, selectivity, and merit. And all of the things that we can say about those terms, positive and negative. Education for all who merit it, that idea was influenced by the federal government, funding agencies such as the Ford Foundation, who saw themselves as fighting a Cold War against, remember it, Soviet Russia. And Russia in the post-World War II era was educating many more people than we were, and we thought that in order to succeed and demonstrate that capitalism was better than communism, we had to do the same. And it even spread into racial desegregation efforts. The Ford Foundation was not going to fund Emory University, for example, unless it desegregated. And this was true of all schools in the South. And that, as much as anything, drove desegregation in higher education schools where people wanted to have a research agenda. The research agenda that we live with was driven by the Cold War, the military-industrial complex. Language education driven by this moment. We are in the post-World War II institution. Merit, as we define it today, has not always been the basis of admissions. Sometimes I teach freshmen and they come in like they're weary from what it took to get there, right? SAT and ACT scores, study, 4.5 GPAs, nationally competitive high school curricula. How many extracurriculars did you do? How many debates did you win? Weary, freshman year. Merit, particularly in our flagship institutions, in our elite schools. The creation of our current admissions process occurred over the course of 2 to 3 decades between the 1950s and 1980s, and it was a response to how do we distinguish among applicants in an increasing pool of applicants. Some good things happened, even with all the issues around selectivity, the old histories, and the problematic politics. Some good things did happen. The percentage of the U.S. population with college degrees between 1940 and 1970 increased In 1940, 5.5% of all men and 3.8% of all women had a college degree. And I remember how shocked I was when I realized that, which was well into my career as a professor. I thought that these numbers were much higher, even in 1940. By 1970, 14.1% of men and 8.2% of women had a college degree. If we look to the present, we can see, well, did I get all the way? No, I did not get all the way to 2020. I was messing with our 2020 census. It's complex. I'll just leave it at that. But in 1980, almost 21% of men, 13.6% of women. By 2015, about a third of each with college degrees. And that's the total U.S. population. So if you skew younger, of course, it's a little higher, but not that much. It's in the 40% if you take off the older generations. So even now, with a more open admissions process, we're still talking about a fairly small number of people with a college degree. If we look 25 and older, again, 1940, it's 4.5%. 2020, it's 37.5%. It's a number we're working with. Now, if we do a racial breakdown, just quickly, 1941, a little over 1% of blacks, about 5% of whites. 1965, 3.8% blacks, about double for whites. And I'll say that the figures in that early period, they did not track other races. They only tracked blacks and whites. So my figures are a little limited by the data. By 74, 5.5% of blacks had a college degree, 14% of whites, and Hispanics appear for the first time with 5.5%. And then if we move to my last year, 2015, almost a quarter of blacks with a college degree, about a third of whites with a college degree, 15.5% Hispanic, and then Asians 53.9%, and that's partly because of the immigration restrictions. That if we're looking at a population that still has a large number of people who are immigrants from Asia, they were not allowed to immigrate in many cases unless they had a college degree. So that they were more likely to be admitted to this country with a college degree. So that's part of the story there in terms of the ways in which that population is outweighing everyone else. And that doesn't seem to be discussed all that much in all these affirmative action cases, but I digress. So we've made some progress. We've opened up higher education, but we are behind. And I'm going to be talking here about documents that were written in the Obama era, long, long ago. In 2015, the Obama administration said, we will have a shortfall of 5 million college-educated workers by 2020, 2 years ago. By 2020, 2 years ago, 65% of all jobs will require bachelor's or associate's degrees or some education beyond high school. We are way behind. Forget about race or gender. We are all way behind in this nation. In 1990, the U.S. ranked first in the world in four-year degree attainment among 25 to 34-year-olds. Today, the 2015 today, we rank 12th. Now, I'm not into competition. I don't really care that much. But something is happening. We don't have to be number one, that's fine, but number two would be nice. But I want to say also, think about education systems in other nations. Our education system in its diversity, in its access, its potential. For a long time, we were the envy of the world because our educational system in its diversity could welcome all kinds of students. HBCUs, their whole mission is taking students who have been in segregated schools through no fault of their own and making those schools not only college ready, but graduate school ready, PhD ready, medical school ready, engineering PhD ready. Without HBCUs, if you think we have a problem now with black professionals, if those schools disappear, there will be no black professionals. They are still the schools that produce most of our black professionals. And frankly, we should be expanding that model rather than watching it die on the vine. This U.S. ranks 12th. That's not good. And it's not good because other countries are catching up to us. It's not good because they're doing better than us at our own game. Why is it important? Well, high school graduates, and you probably know this from the wealthiest families, are almost certain to continue, while just over half of our high school graduates in the poorest quarter of our families attend college. And the completion rate for lower income students is around 25% within 6 years. So not even 4 years, but 6 years. So we have a financial problem as well. And this again is from the Obama White House's study on higher education. Now, why is it important? The median weekly earnings of a full-time employee with a bachelor's degree were 64% higher of a fully employed high school graduate. That does not include health insurance, vacation days, and all other kinds of non-wage compensation that are available to college grads. Intergenerational mobility increases with higher education. If you're born into poverty without a college degree, you're much more likely to remain in the bottom quintile of income as adults. With a college degree, you have less than 20% chance of remaining there. So these are methods of advancement. Now, the pandemic. So happy to be with you in person, but the pandemic continues. In the fall, by fall 2021, post-secondary enrollments in general had dropped by 5.8%, and undergraduate enrollment in particular had dropped by 7.8%. So we're already falling behind, and then, of course, the pandemic. If we look at this in racial terms, we can see that Native American students are the worst off, followed by Black students, Latinx, Asian, and then, I'm doing it a little bit out of order. White students are after Black students, and then Latinx and Asian. So we are seeing some deep inroads into the progress that we've made, and we're already struggling to keep. But our highest declines, and I'm not going to talk about this a lot today, are in public two-year colleges, double digits across the board, even as the Biden administration pulls back on the promise of free community college. Again, remember, at least a two-year degree will improve your chances. And we can't even promise that. I want to talk just briefly about higher education institutions as employers as well, and then I'll be pretty close to wrapping up. When I began the work at Emory, someone pressed into my hand this book, Harvard Works Because We Do. It was photographs and essays written and conducted by a student who had been involved in the living wage campaign in 2001 at Harvard. And as part of that campaign, he got to know workers at Harvard, and he wanted to tell their stories. And as he says and as they say, none of these institutions survive. None of these institutions go anywhere without the laborers who come in early in the morning and make sure the chalk is on the board, that the classrooms are clean, the bathrooms are clean and have all the supplies. The food is made, and this is not news, and it's not new. It has been true since the slavery that all of these studies are studying. And yet those people who make the places work are most often forgotten. My former institution, Emory, when I started that work, was the second largest employer in the Atlanta area. I was looking up the figures to see what was going on now. I assumed it had stayed the same, but no, they have displaced my favorite airline, Delta. And for the past 3 years, they have become the top employer in the Atlanta area. The University of Florida is also the top employer in the Gainesville area. And you can go to many places where higher education institutions sit and realize that as the top employer in their communities, the community is not out there, we are not in an ivory tower, these two things are together. And again, I want to say often the largest group of people on campus is not the students, it's not the faculty, it's staff. Colleges and universities are leading employers in our communities. They have been historically and they are today. and they can set the tone for labor relations. They can either provide a floor or a ceiling. Student movements have often pushed questions about the status of labor on campuses. And again, I want to remind you that when we started the Transforming Community Project, our precursor, our foundational work was someone who had investigated with his students, Mark Auslander, had investigated the history of labor, who built the institution, who continued to work in the institution, that those stories were the stories that the students and faculty member were most interested in recovering. When I ran the Transforming Community Project, staff were the people, the largest group of people who turned out to have their experiences heard, and so they should have been. We higher education institutions, and particularly those of us who seem to have more power, faculty and students, need to be asking more questions. I'll never forget going to my first all-staff meeting and realizing that while I lived in a majority white institution in my department as a faculty member, the people who were running the institution were majority non-white. It was completely reversed. Who are hired as staff people? What is their status within the institution? How are employment practices part of the mission of the institution? What about fair wages, insurance, child care, tuition benefits? Those were trimmed when I was at Emory, much to my disappointment. Opportunities for growth. If you work in an institution, do you feel that it's a place that supports your growth? Everyone wants to grow. How are higher education institutions and communities as citizens? Who's welcome on campus? Are we good neighbors? Lots of institutions are not good neighbors. No, they're scooping up property. They're driving up prices. It's not just here, it's everywhere. What do we contribute to our neighborhoods, towns, cities, counties, and states? We are critical in addressing many of the problems we face in society today. We have so much knowledge. On this campus, on every campus I've ever been to, there are visionary people, people who have studied history, urban planning, engineering, you name it, it's everywhere. And yet our institutions, our administrators don't ask our advice. And we do not often figure out ways to really make change in the community out there that we imagine is not us. We can provide spaces for reflection, spaces of physical beauty, if we are welcoming, but we should also model civic engagement and be an active social, political, and economic presence in and with, I should have with our communities. Not just coming in and telling them, but listening and asking. All institutions of higher education produce graduates who influence local, national, and international communities, but they also employ citizens who influence local, national, and international communities. How will we encourage our citizens and our graduates to address the challenges we face, and how will we support them? Climate change, poverty, racial inequality, and I had to add this since the last time I talked about this, the pandemic and our democracy. We are at a critical inflection point, and I know I don't have to tell you, and I know you're hearing it every day. But we have got to think about what is our responsibility in modeling a more equitable society, in helping to create a more equitable society. Are we doing enough to handle the challenges and opportunities offered by the needs of our diverse populations? And I'm not just talking about diversifying faculty and students. I'm talking about everyone on this campus, everyone in the community that surrounds and supports this campus, everyone who is surrounded and supported by this campus. How do we really make some of our ideals live? These are the challenges that were raised early on by the slavery and university projects. Once we have a self-critical sense of who we are as institutions and realize that sometimes we talk a good game about these issues, how can we really make them happen? Our next step wasn't just to stop there. It was to create change, and then hopefully that change would also walk out and live in the world. 20 years in, I'm not so sure we've been able to do that. I'll say, I'm an historian, I like talking to dead people. So I'm not necessarily the one who's going to figure out how to do that, but there are plenty of people on this campus who enjoy talking to the living and working the problem. How do we get that resource among faculty, staff, students, and alums to really enact the change that we claim we want to see? That is the challenge of 20 years of studying slavery in universities. And I hope that you will be able to live into that challenge, and I hope I live to see it. Thank you.
So we do have a mic back here for questions internally, and if you're remote, again, the bubble feature in the lower right corner of your screen to submit them, and we'll access them here. So, do you have a question?
Yeah. If you have a question, just please raise your hand. And
Well, thank you, Professor Harris, for that great talk. As you know, schools now are elite schools are not using the SAT or ACT as a result of what happened in California. You know, years ago, African Americans said get rid of that test, but now want to get rid of the test. So how can students from public high schools compete with kids from boarding schools? Because we know an A is not an A, it's not an A. So again, it's again reinforcing elite inequality within our elite institutions, which leads to higher paying jobs and different networks. It's like going back full circle.
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. And I have so many thoughts about admissions practices. So I applied to an elite school and got in way back when in 1983. And the rigmarole around admissions that's happening now was not, it was just beginning then in terms of prepping and doing all of these things. I think, so a couple of things about admissions. We assume, I think, and particularly people who are outside the system, assume that when a class is chosen, that people literally have earned something. They have risen to the top, they've fought off other people. I would like us to imagine that that class that comes on campus on whatever date it is in the fall for their first year could be replicated 50 million times, right? Each of those people could have been replaced, if it's 200, could have been replaced with another 200. If it's 10,000, could have been replaced with another 10,000. And that's just on the numbers. So even without the SAT, that's just on the elite aspect, right? What about asking the question, not who is the best, but who can take advantage of this opportunity? Who can come here and thrive? How can we think of another way for admissions, which isn't about ranking 1 to 100 or 1 to 10,000, but is about finding people who need the opportunity, who will do something different with the opportunity than what we expect, who have that spark, who might need a little extra help? So that's one thing that I think about a lot. I've spent my whole life from high school in selective institutions, either a test to get in or an admissions process or whatever. And what I know, because I was never the smartest person in the room, what I always know is that there are many more people who could have taken advantage of the opportunity that I was lucky to get. Not that I didn't work hard, but I was in the right place at the right time. I was lucky. There are many more people not as lucky, and maybe on the numbers didn't look as smart or didn't have the opportunity I'd had in high school or didn't go to the college I went to, who could have done just as well, if not better. I'm one of 4 daughters. We are equally successful and went to 4 different high schools. One didn't go to college. She's running a hotel. You know what I mean? Like, we know that this is possible, and yet we have narrowed that. My other thing is that we have higher education institutions that admit large numbers of people, that CUNY, City University of New York, is still an open admissions. Now, they do rank people to different campuses. I literally just learned this 2 days ago, according to the numbers. But if you apply, you don't apply to CUNY per se. It is open admissions in that if you want to go to college, you can go. The problem is not admissions. It's helping people who desperately want and need a college degree, but who don't have the support to gain the skills to survive. How do we, so even more so than thinking about opening up our elite institutions, how do we reverse the resources that elite institutions hold and give them to the people who need them more? I'll give you my example of this. So, pandemic happens, Northwestern switches to Zoom. I had workshops. My TA and the office administrator were told to go to workshops to handhold me, right? So I was sailing. I was like, Zoom, let's go. If anything ever happened technologically, I had someone waiting to fix it, blah, 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 blah. My partner who teaches at CUNY Staten Island, which is the lowest ranked CUNY, got an email. We're switching to Zoom. Here's the link. Good luck to you. Literally. Her students who are commuters, who do not, barely have, this is New York City, families living in one-bedroom apartments. Brother taking sister to work at Amazon. Amazon warehouse is where the majority of the Staten Island students work. He's driving with the class on his phone, trying to keep up. Did I need two people to hold my hand? No. But did those students need laptops and a place to go where they could actually have a quiet room? One of her students, his mother and wife and baby, during the 3-hour class, because it's a writing class, would leave the apartment on Friday night between 7 and 10 so he could finish his class. Really? Is this the country I live in? This is ridiculous. So I work in institutions where I could ask tomorrow for any number of things. And here are these students struggling to watch their professor on an iPhone. So how do we reverse those resource issues? How do we, one of the things that I think slavery and universities could do, this university studying slavery, and I know they're thinking about it, is not as individual institutions. So we talk reparations, whatever, reparations, yes, but repair. Not individual institutions, but what if groups of institutions came together, created funds that they could then, in whatever way that's possible, donate to less well-resourced institutions? What if well-resourced institutions shared the financial in those offices where they figure out how to keep those endowments going up and up? What if they shared a little bit of that intellectual financial resource with less well-resourced institutions? What if we just even out that playing field across elite and non-elite, and by that I mean financially elite and non-elite institutions? And that's just on the private sector. The public school sector, of course, has been disemboweled by state legislatures for the last 15, 20 years? The amount the state contributes, smaller and smaller and smaller. I don't know where our tax dollars are going, but they're not helping many. And so we still have that to figure out as well. So how do we even out these resource questions? Because not everyone wants to go to flagship, and that's fine. Some people want to go to the state school in their district, or the HBCU over here, or the small, or like my nephew, hated high school, didn't know if he would like college. He went to Delgado Community College. Turns out he was great at it. So I don't know what happened in high school, but he was straight A's in community college. So now he's going to the 4-year, but he needed that on-ramp, as many students do. We have so many possibilities for higher education in this country, but they're being killed off. A country this diverse needs diversity in how it educates, and that diversity is not a bad thing. It is a great thing. So everyone doesn't need to get straight A's to go to the best of the best, whatever. That definition should not be our only working definition of higher education.
We have a question from someone that's watching online. So she says, thank you for an amazing talk. I was Dr. Patricia Hilliard-Nunn's student, and I'm so grateful to be able to listen to a talk supported by her legacy. My question, what are the most useful strategies you've seen universities use to educate about their history to be good neighbors?
Educating about the history is the easy part. Good neighbors is the hard part. So education, I really think that what we did, which was we did not do one and done, as in 1 year and done. We had available for people over a 5-year period the community dialogues, people meeting in small groups, people who really wanted to know about the history, who could do that deep dive. But we also did annual events. We did an annual event, Experiencing Race at Emory, and we always had it around a theme that was up in the community, so that we could sort of reach different segments of the community every year. So 1 year it was about healthcare. The first year it was about welcoming back those who had desegregated the university, many of whom had felt very alienated by that experience, and so we welcomed them back and honored their contribution to making Emory more equitable. And really working to figure out, when we had those big one-time public events, who were the people who would care about this, and inviting them specifically. So you could have this sort of open-ended set of events and then a very specific targeted set of events. But the most important thing is that it can't be just a 1-year thing. Someone once asked me, if we put up a monument to slavery, how do we ensure that it continues to hold meaning? And I say, the monument doesn't hold meaning. The community holds the meaning. The continuing knowledge of the community holds the meaning for that. I mean, there are names all over buildings on every campus I know, but I wouldn't know what the history of it is because no one cares anymore, right? So that part, though, I think is easy. I mean, we as educators know a lot about that. We have this rotating group of students who come through, but we know how to reinforce ideas and how to do that in a way that is, we can refresh that and do innovative things. In terms of being a good neighbor, that is a huge can of worms, but one that really needs to be addressed. So my alma mater, Columbia in New York, has been taking over neighborhoods through most of its existence, and I'm ashamed to say has continued to do so. It is knocking down affordable housing. It just bought a building where an amazing grocery store that unfortunately went bankrupt. Now it's creating a food desert of sorts. And it does this in the name of education, progress. We need science. We need to know more things. But people also need places to live. And ability, they were able to purchase that building cash for $84 million. What? Wow. And so, these institutions that I love, who gave me the skills to critique them, they are sitting on so much money, so much wealth, and they can do almost anything they want, both because they have the wealth and because they are seen as important economic actors in these communities. But who are they acting for as economic actors? So then the question is, it's a genuine question for me, who puts pressure on them to do it differently? How do we put pressure? There's always students and faculty who say this is wrong. And yet, is it not enough? There are also alums who say this is wrong. They're not the same alums who are putting their names on the buildings, but there are alums. So how do we do this? And the community is never consulted. So this will take really a change in how institutions see themselves. And part of this building, some of this is about this competitive idea of education as well. U.S. News and World Reports has accelerated this idea that the way to be in the top 10 or whatever it is, one, that it's important. But if we're thinking about higher education as something that is a diverse set of institutions serving a diverse group of people, what does it mean to be number one in one area and number 1,000 in rejecting people? It doesn't make any sense actually for the mission of higher education, which post-World War II, I thought, was to educate as many people as possible. We're not a disco on Friday night. We're trying to welcome people in, not kick people out. So that's one thing. And so this idea of competition, and often competition on the wrong measures, means that this ever-growing expansion is problematic. It becomes the driver rather than how do I cooperate with my community. I don't think there's any line in the U.S. News and World Report that asks institutions to be rated on their university-community relationships. So we have to have a philosophical change of who we are and what we're doing. We have to think about that differently. And we have to realize, again, that we're part of a community. We're not a community trying to protect ourselves from something out there.
You showed us some information on the percent of graduates, college degrees and masters and PhDs in the general population. But I know so many people who go through their junior year and drop out, or they go through their PhD classes and they get all their classes but no dissertation. Is there any documentation on these people who have college educations but they're not college graduates?
There is, and I didn't go deep into that. And I want to say my figures were only college graduates, so
Right.
they didn't include advanced degree people for the most part. For many, it's money. So people who are taking 6 years, they're often saving up, or they have so many loans, or they have to work to support themselves, and so they can only take a few classes. The other piece is, I think, under preparation sometimes at the high school level, and so they have to take extra classes at the college level, so that adds on to the years. But the major piece is the financial piece. And I think it tracks pretty clearly and closely with how much money you and your family have to devote to education. It's one thing, to be from a wealthy family. Maybe you have some bumps. You have to take a little extra tutoring. You do a little extra this. You don't have to work. And then you can sort of make up your deficiencies as you're going along, and you still finish in 4 years. If you're working 30, 40, 50 hours a week, and you're behind the 8 ball already because you have some deficiencies from your high school background, then it's going to be pretty tough. It's financial, no question. And sometimes even just lack of time to get to the resources that could help you. Can you make the office hours? Can you get to, even if there's free tutoring, do you have time to get to free tutoring?
But is there any documentation about how
Yeah,
many
all
people-
of the, yeah, I can give you the organizations that I pulled some of those figures from. There's tons of documentation. You could, I probably don't have to. I'm sure there's an education school here. It's well documented.
Okay.
Hi, Dr. Harris. Kenneth Nunn is my name. I'm a law professor here. I was Patricia Hilliard-Nunn's husband. I really appreciate your coming here and for this great talk. And there's just so many things kind of swimming through my head that I'd like to ask you about, and hopefully, we'll have some time to chat after
Yes.
The conversation. But one of the things that comes up a lot when you start approaching the legacy of slavery here in the United States is the question of what to do with monuments and buildings that were named. You mentioned that in
Yes,
your earlier discussion. And I'm curious whether there's any uniform approach to that you've been able to identify in looking at the various institutions and what they were doing in terms of, okay, well, it's a good idea to rename these things. It's not a good idea to rename them. If you do rename it, you want to do it in this way as opposed to that way. Can you speak to that?
Sure, yeah. I think, people have been all over the map. So some of the institutions have set up, just thinking about higher education, some institutions have set up commissions, either standing or ad hoc, that when an issue comes up, that commission sits and studies, well, what was the intent when the building was named or the monument went up? What is the history that we're dealing with? What do people who are on any side of the issue, people want to take it down, people want to keep it, what are those constituencies thinking? So that is a process that I've seen very often. I think it was part of the process at Princeton. Where else? Harvard, Brown, Emory. I'll say it's also a process that helps when, so Emory, long before the kind of current issues we're in, I think in the 1990s, like I may have just gotten tenure, the person who eventually became the university historian contacted me and said, here's some histories of Emory. We want to rename some of the creeks for some of the people who worked here because they're not representing the landscape. So long before this whole moment that we've been in, so more than 20 years ago. And so some schools already had these kinds of processes in place and were being thoughtful. The other thing that happens, and this is also represented in the Princeton example, is just pressure. Political pressure, alumni pressure, embarrassment, and that sometimes pushes institutions, as it did with Princeton, to take the name Woodrow Wilson off, to move in a different direction, shall we say. Those moments are, sometimes it's just, a group of people at the top who say we can't take the heat. Is there another part of your question? Yeah. Personally, yeah, to have the pressure be the prime move, or I think it's all pretty complicated. So I personally, when I looked at what Princeton did with Woodrow Wilson's name and then this commentary on Woodrow Wilson, as an historian, I love that because I think that when we look at monuments, they're often meant to only send one message, that this person is great and everything they did was fine. And someone like Wilson is more complicated than that. All of the founding fathers, the traditional founding fathers, are more complicated than that. And how can we commemorate what they did that was good and that we still live with in a positive way, and all of the other things they did that led us astray, led us down a place we don't want to go anymore. So as an historian, I wish there was some way that we could have a more complex sense of memorialization, of commemoration, which is not unreservedly positive. The other thing, I said this in a class I visited earlier today, that's disturbing sometimes about the urgency, I'll say, of renaming, and particularly in the Princeton example, with Princeton, with taking down the Confederate flag in South Carolina after the massacre at the Emmanuel Church there, in both cases I was like, really? How many black people have to die before you listen to our reasoned arguments about the meaning of the Confederate flag, or how this person was racist and segregationist and advocated violence against black people? Sometimes it's not, the process is one in which black people are again sacrificed, if you know what I mean. And that sacrifice is the only way that change happens. So I sometimes find myself as someone who appreciates a complex iconography, but realizes that for some, that complexity is a way of getting out of a hard question of you continue to honor someone who advocates for the death of a whole group of people, as an example, then that I end up, sometimes against my will, siding with the people who want to take the monument down. We could talk about the history another way, but this just needs to go. The pushback sometimes pushes me to be, I don't even want to say less generous, less intellectual about it. But I think it's a loss in terms of, again, not in a deeper way rethinking what memorialization means. So one of my favorite memorials, which I still haven't seen, are the, what do they call, the Stolpersteine in Germany, where in the ground they put memorial to some of the Jews who were removed because of the Holocaust. So that's a memorial of a horrific event, and it is meant to trip you up, if you will, to make you stop and think. I think often names on buildings don't do that, but disturbing those names in some way can do that. And so I would hope that we could get to a more complex understanding of memorialization. Is that? Yeah.
Thank you very much. We're out of time for the evening's presentation. I want to thank Dr. Harris for her talk. I also want to say really quickly, the Graham Center is deeply committed to serving as a facilitator of some of these difficult conversations around how the University of Florida can be a more effective member in our community and partner with our community, but also to think through some of these difficult questions about the future of universities and higher education and diversity and inclusion and so on. So thank you very much, Dr. Harris. We've been delighted by your talk and your visit here. And please join me in giving her a round of applause.